the Alabama Aquarium at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab and to our Boardwalk Talks program. My name is Mendel Graber. I am one of the here at the lab, and this is Zoey Hendrickson, who is a PhD student in Dr. Charlie's lab. So this morning she's going to chat with us about different types of habitats and how animals use different types of habitats, and we'll particularly focus on those that are in our local area. So with that, I'm going to let Zoey tell you a little bit about the different aspects of habitat that will affect how animals use them.
Yeah, thank you, Mendel. So my name is Zoey, like she said, and in our lab we call ourselves estuarine ecologists. So we're concerned with,
speak up a little bit.
Sorry. We're concerned with all of the different kind of underwater habitats here in Mobile Bay and kind of rivers meet the sea. So I do a little bit of everything, but today I'm going to talk specifically about habitats and their physical structure. So what we mean by physical structure, it can be a whole myriad of things. It could be plants, it could be rocks. So on land, an example of physical habitat would be like the trees that the birds sit in, or cliffs that are in like the Grand Canyon that birds live in. Sorry, birds are a really good example. But anyway, there's a lot of different things that can be considered habitat. And in general, in ecology, we're really concerned with biodiversity. And that relates to how many different kinds of animals are living in one place. The more different kinds of things you have, usually the healthier the ecosystem is. Once you only start to see like one or two species left, that's a good sign that your ecosystem is not doing well. So we've found as scientists, on land and in the water, that physical habitat structure, the more complex your structure is, that the higher your biodiversity would be. And kind of the thought behind that is like if you have a more complex structure, so for example, you can think of a blade of grass being really simplistic versus like a tree being something really complex. There's lots of branches, there's a lot of nooks and crannies that things can hide in of different sizes. So that's kind of the idea behind habitat complexity. And so underwater, especially around here, we have a lot of different types of habitat. Aquatic plants are a really good example of a type of habitat. We also have both natural and man-made habitats. So oyster reefs are another really good example of physical habitat. The oysters are animals, but they compile on top of each other and it forms like a reef, kind of like a coral reef. A coral reef's another example. We also have these man-made reef balls that we put out to kind of provide a physical habitat where there might not be one. And so this is kind of like a man-made solution to try to get more things to come to an area. Maybe a habitat has been really disturbed, like we've kind of taken out all the plants or taken out all the structure, and we're like, oh man, all that's left is sand. There's not a lot for anything to live in. So we'll put those physical structures out to kind of encourage things to come. Okay.
There's a cannon at the pool next door.
Another good example for things not necessarily coastal, but in rivers, if you have downed trees, that's another good example of physical habitat. So Mendel brought out this piece of driftwood that's been kind of bored into. Highly complex piece of habitat. And then specifically what I study are different aquatic plants. And I can pass these around. These are plastic plants. They're not real. But we use these in our experiments to simulate habitat. So if we're trying to figure out how does a certain fish behave when it's provided with different structures. It's really easy to use plastic plants because we can control a lot of variables. They're not going to eat the plant, they're just going to respond to the structure of the plants. So do you want to look at it? We can pass things around. So the first one I handed out, it's a type of grass called Vallisneria. It also looks like seagrass, so you can use it for multiple things. But that would be an example of something really simplistic. A couple more that I have in here without making too much noise. So here's another example of a plant. You can see this is a lot different than the Vallisneria. There's a lot of little leaves. Each shoot, so how many shoots are on a plant can also be an example of different structures. So this is something called hydrilla. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. It's kind of one of those big name, really bad invaders. If you've ever gone to Florida, use the word hydrilla, and they're like, oh, it's terrible. And someone will rant for about 20 minutes on why it's terrible. But it could provide habitat where there is none. So is it terrible? That's my research question. So I can pass these around. Sorry, I'm kind of tethered to the camera. Here's another one. This is supposed to replicate southern naiad. People may not have heard that one before, but essentially, like, I'm passing these around habitat that they provide. We can measure a lot of different things like leaf width or number of leaves, how long a shoot is, how fast it grows, to kind of get an idea of what type of habitat that plants can provide. And then I can keep rambling, but if you want
let's expand the scope just a little bit.
Yeah.
In geographic area, if we talk about what is found naturally out in much of the Gulf of Mexico, it has flat sandy bottom. So comparatively, that doesn't provide a lot of structure for habitat for animals to hide. In nooks and crannies, and a lot of surface area to attach to, like for barnacles or oysters or different kinds of worms that attach to things. And so what we tend to see is that animals will congregate around the areas where there are structures. So some examples that Zoe gave were oyster reefs. We have an oyster there. Oysters are animals. They make two shells, kind of like clams or mussels, but oysters attach to things. So they might attach to docks, or they might attach to piers, but they also attach to each other. And so when a lot of oysters attach to each other, they form, as Zoe described it, what we call a reef. So kind of like a coral reef. So coral reefs also provide a lot of structure, but we don't have coral reefs in the northern Gulf of Mexico.
It's a little too cold.
Yeah. So the oyster reefs are one example, and we find them more in the inshore waters. We also have old remnant oyster reefs. So there's a little bit of this. The oysters are no longer living, but sometimes the old reef gets exposed. Sometimes it's covered by sand or mud. Sometimes it gets exposed, and so there's that hard structure that provides habitat. Also, off the coast of Alabama, we have an extensive artificial reef system. So people have put a lot of physical structures off the coast of Alabama to provide habitat and attract fish. They've done this to attract fish that are desirable for eating. So people want to fish them and eat the fish. But they also provide a lot of habitat for other kinds of organisms. There are floating structural habitats in the Gulf of Mexico. So one of them is sargassum. So you may have heard of sargassum seaweed. It's a floating algae, and it'll drift in big mats, and it provides a lot of structural habitat that attach to, and they can hide among the blades of the sargassum, and so it kind of attracts food. As you can think of this as food as well, so they can find habitat and food. And then this is a piece of driftwood that what has created these holes is an animal that it's called a shipworm, but shipworms are actually clams. Shipworm is kind of a misnomer, and so it has used this as habitat. Wood, and you can see some other things that have attached on here. So you may see some barnacles, you may see there's a colonial animal that kind of looks like a little lacy crust called a bryozoa. You might see some worm tubes on here. So if you guys want to take a closer look at this, pass that around. You're welcome to just look for evidence of the different kinds of animals that you may find in there. And then if we kind of move north a little bit, Zoe kind of focuses her research on the Mobile Delta area where we have a lot of fresh water flowing into Mobile Bay. So Mobile Bay, which you can see behind you, is kind of a transition zone between the Gulf of Mexico and the Mobile Tensas River Delta, where there's a lot of fresh water flowing in. So it depends on where you are in the northern Gulf of Mexico, but this underwater vegetation, we call it submerged aquatic vegetation, SAV, sometimes kind of a term that may be in more common use, but we're trying to shift, is seagrass, because we're also submerged aquatic vegetation that are, the brackish water areas where you have a mix of fresh and saltwater, or freshwater areas. So you call it seagrass. You might have heard it called seagrass. We might refer to it as SAV, submerged aquatic vegetation, to include those freshwater species. So then there is a lot of that submerged aquatic vegetation up in the northern
Delta
end of the Mobile Bay and in the Mobile Delta. We don't have much of the true seagrass, which is, saltwater species in our area, because we have a lot of sediment that flows in with those rivers, and it makes the water kind of murky, so there's not a lot of sunlight penetration for those species. But excuse me.
There you go.
So excuse me. So that's just kind of like a broad overview of what's kind of understood habitat complexity, and then some of the different kinds of habitats we have here. We also have salt marshes that are grassy wetlands that grow right at the edge of land and sea. But then she's looking at like more kind of getting into the nitty gritty of the different kinds of, plants that are present and how they differ in terms of attracting animals. Are you looking at, I know you're comparing different plants. Do you have specific animals you're looking at? Or are you looking more generally at how those plants differ, attracting like animals as a broad?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because you can look at a lot of different kinds of animals. It depends on the scale that you want to look at. And what we mean by that is you can have really, really tiny things that live in like nooks and crannies of different types of habitat, including different plants. But ultimately, those little tiny animals are food for fish or for other things, for crabs, for whatever lives in the water around it. And so that's a good, you brought up, I think, this driftwood. Can I pass this around? So another thing that kind of is important with your different habitat, something's going to start growing on it, whether it's or an algae, tiny little arthropods that are these little tiny kind of crab-looking things. They're not crabs, but they almost look like roly-polies.
That's what I say. It's like a cross between a roly-poly and a shrimp.
Yeah. But those are in freshwater and saltwater, depending on the species. But all of that surface area, all those different kinds of complexity in the habitat, especially different plants, will relate, kind of trickles up the food chain. So you have to have either plants or algae for your small things to eat. Those small things feed, small fish. Those small fish feed bigger fish, and so on and so forth. With that. Another thing too, you mentioned, we have oysters down here in the coastal area, in northern Gulf of Mexico, and then as you move up the river, you don't have oysters, you don't have the same kind of structure. And so understanding what each of these kind of structures provides in each ecosystem lets you know the function of the ecosystem and how to protect it better. You know what each organism needs in order to survive. So in the upper, we have a lot more vegetation. So down in kind of near Perdido is where we have a lot of, that's to the east of here, over by Gulf Shores. Once you get towards that direction, the water's a lot more clear. So you Mobile Delta and the river flows down and then it goes to the west. So to the west, the water looks like chocolate milk a lot of the time. Don't drink it. It does not taste like chocolate milk. But to the east, it's a lot clearer. So you have seagrass in that environment, and then up in the freshwater part of the delta, you have a lot of vegetation. But what we're seeing in more so excluded from that is we have invasive species that come in and they introduce kind of a different plant community. And the question that I'm trying to answer is, what are the effects of shifting that vegetation? So a lot of the time, can I see this really quick? Thank you. So a lot of the time our native, both our seagrass and our native vegetation at delta, the freshwater, it's two different species, but they look like this. And so this is, you know, kind of long and grassy, you know, fish can hide in there. There's a lot of good surface area. That, here, I'll hand you this to Mendel, thank you. Something that looks like this. And this is supposed to look like milfoil. So milfoil is another really big invader that we've heard thrown around. So a lot of what we're seeing in the delta is our grasses are getting replaced by milfoil. And my advisor's research has shown that milfoil can actually support a lot of tiny organisms in here. So you might still be getting a decent amount of habitat from this. But since the milfoil is so dense, there's a lot of branching. It kind of looks like a bottle brush almost. It kind of creates these really, really dense mats. And we were finding that we haven't done more research on this, but we to at nighttime, the oxygen levels kind of below these plants drop really heavily, and so the fish have to like completely vacate if that's the case, whereas that doesn't happen in the native grasses. And so, you know, you can have kind of these strange
Do you know why?
impact. We don't yet. It probably has to do with how dense it is, but that's something that he wants to do more
So
research
when
on.
they form those dense mats, they can shade out any that may, these are floating.
So
That
they
one-
root in the ground and then they are very floaty. So they get really long. I think they can grow, I know hydrilla can grow like 30 centimeters a day or something like that.
So they'll, I mean,
grow
she
really
mentioned
fast.
like the mats that float at the surface, but they'll
Yeah.
shade out other plants, including the native plants that would not, they would need that sunlight that these plants are then depriving them of.
So you have not only like a shift to a different type of plant, then you say, okay, was there, you know, a snail or an arthropod or something that was dependent on that native plant? Because you also have very closely linked relationships between small organisms and the plants that they feed on. For example, terrestrial or on land, when you have invasive trees that come in, certain species of butterflies will no longer lay their eggs on those trees. They need a specific type of tree to lay their eggs. And so then the birds have nothing to eat come springtime. So similar types of things can happen in the aquatic environment.
But with relationships that
Yeah.
apply with these plants that we have not figured out yet.
Yeah. And it does structural element, because there's something about foil with all its little nooks and crannies that is providing like potentially more of a food source or more of a place to hide for little tiny. What's the problem? But if you know, if it's going anoxic at night, if all the oxygen's leaving of this plant.
So if we go back for just a minute, let's talk about what invasives are. They are organisms that are introduced into areas where they did not evolve. So they don't have these evolved relationships in the ecosystem. And we characterize, they start causing environmental problems. So one of the problems that they tend to cause is a reduction in the biodiversity. So Zoey mentioned the importance of biodiversity in the health of an ecosystem. So just to give you a couple of examples of why that might be important, if there are only a couple of, you know, the fewer number of species you have in an area, the more vulnerable it may be to collapse. So say there's a disease that impacts one of those organisms, then you might have a big die-off in that area. Whereas if you had 50 different species and one of them dies off, it's not as big an impact. That ecosystem is more resilient. So that's one example of how that greater biodiversity would, it would be an indication of better health of an ecosystem. Yeah. And one, so that's why we characterize them as invasive, is because they're causing problems. So, she's suggesting that they might, there might be some cases where they have a particular benefit, like providing habitat and structural habitat for a lot of different kinds of animals. But then,
these more murky areas, do plants grow on those structures? And my answer to that is no, plants do not grow, but algae can. Other things like sponges, things that need kind of a structure to cling to will grow on there. There are certain corals that we do get out here,
reef building.
They're not your reef building corals, but they are corals that still provide kind of some structure and some base level of production, as in like you take light and there's algae in the coral. So those will grow on man-made reefs. And there is a big question though as to how beneficial man-made reefs are. The assumption when we started putting these things out there is, oh, it provides a structure. All the fish, when we put one out, we come back and there's a ton of fish around the structure.
And by we, let me just clarify, she doesn't
like
mean
managers
like
and
her lab or the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, but the state of Alabama started permitting these
and Florida
decades
does
ago.
It too. Yeah. It's a pretty common practice. If I say we, I usually mean like someone in the scientific community, humans. So they've put these out there because fishermen really like them too, because once you put out an artificial reef, a bunch of fish will show up. And you say, oh, wow, we've increased the biodiversity. But there is a question are we increasing the biodiversity, or are these things just drawn to the structure and then we're fishing them down even more because they're like fish magnets? So it's kind of a question between, is a man-made reef good as something that was naturally there before that is no longer there now? And it's kind of, I'm in those questions scientifically. There's lots of really cool people who are.
We have a lot of fisheries research here at the lab, but that's kind of a different area of research. Were you wondering about that leading to a different question?
Well, I just was curious if I knew with murky water and the lack of sunshine, I
Yeah.
know if these kind of plants would grow out there, and I'm sure seaweed and everything else.
So these are freshwater plants. So one of the restrictions is not necessarily the light penetration, but the salinity. There are saltwater seagrasses. They're not actually true grasses, but as a group of organisms, we give them the term seagrasses, and they tend to grow in shallow, warm water that's kind of clear and allows for light penetration, but they are actually rooted. So they're not drifting like the sargassum. Sargassum is an algae, and it will float and live unattached to the bottom. But the seagrasses are rooted, and they need to be rooted, so they're in they're close to shore generally.
So that's a good clarification between seaweed and seagrass. Seaweed is an algae, and there's a lot of different types. Sometimes they need like a rock to cling to. When it's a seagrass, you can think of it as like a grass, like something that's in your yard. It's very similar where they need to root. But as far as structure goes, the difference here, plants rooted and they will provide a structure, whereas you can have different types. So like the plants would be a type of structure, and like a man-made reef would be another type of structure. And they both provide different benefits, and they both would kind of gather different organisms. But the plants would be a good example of something that you can't necessarily just put one out there. And like you can't, like seagrass restoration and also like freshwater grass restoration, it's really hard to do because they have those specific salinity and light requirements. So it was a really good question. And that's why we're so interested in these relationships between the different plants. Whereas, you know, you can just kind of put an artificial reef and see what happens. Yeah.
So I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
Does the state do milfoil mitigation? If so, for how long? And what have they found as the evolution of that mitigation?
That's a great question for my lab mate, Anna, who studies that.
Okay.
As far as I know, and I'll try to do her justice here, because she's specifically studying herbicides and milfoil. Thank you. So in the Delta, I don't believe they do any mitigation in the Delta because it's a really huge area. They refer to it as like the braided river system. So if you look at a map, the northern end of the Delta, it's like rivers everywhere. And so it'd be really hard to control either physically removing something. That can be really difficult, and that can also take a toll on the environment. Like if you're when you uproot stuff in your garden, there's a lot of dirt, there's a lot of,
Another characteristic of invasives is that they've largely just escaped our control of, of any hope for us controlling them. Otherwise, if we could control them, we wouldn't characterize them as invasive. So a lot of the emphasis is on preventing spread of things that we know to be invasive in environmental conditions in certain areas. So unfortunately, although we do, make attempts to mitigate invasive species, usually I'd say that we don't have a lot of success with it.
It's really
I'm sure
tricky.
you know, Minnesota and Wisconsin, it's killing a lot of the inland lakes.
Yeah, and that's the thing is it's in the lakes though. So if you have a small lake, it can be kind of easier to control. That's the tricky part with aquatic invasives, whether it's plants, fish. Like Mendel said, once they're in the water, it's really hard to control them. Even if they're in a small pond, we can't go in there and really observe where the fish are and what's going on. And then I wanted to mention too, specifically with milfoil, and this is a really good model that I have actually. When you pretty much the only really effective way to get rid of this is either physically removing it or spraying it with herbicides. And because the upper delta is so open and so non-contained, you can't really spray with herbicides effectively. And then also some research that my advisor has done looks at the fragmentation, and what that means is these things can separate, and boat propellers can do this, physical remover can do this, the wind can do this, and essentially this little bit, once it frags off, floats down to a new spot and can root. So a lot of these aquatic plants, not the native grasses, they don't reproduce by just breaking off a piece and rooting a new one.
So attempts to remove them physically can actually potentially make it worse.
Yeah. But that's a good question though. I don't think they're doing anything in the Delta right now, but it's also variable. Thank you. These things have different salinity tolerances, and the saltiness of the bay can fluctuate a whole lot depending on how much rain we've got coming down the river and depending on the tides and the winds. So the Delta is kind of a complicated system, but
there's also a man-made road, we call it the causeway, that stretches across the lower end of the Delta between Mobile County and Baldwin County. But this is it's a Delta river system. So they constructed, land to put this on to stretch across. And when it was done in the 30s, it was done kind of just above water level, and it created something you might think of as kind of like a dam. They have since built another
I-10,
interstate and byway across there. And they call that the Bayway to contrast it with the causeway. But it's raised, and it permits a lot more water flow past it. So there's some interesting dynamics with the water flow, but not just the water flow, the the salinity, because you've got this this transition zone between the salty water of Mobile Bay and then the fresh water of the river systems, where you might have during the part of the year where you're not getting as much river flow, as much rain, as much river flow, pushing that fresh water south. You may have more saltwater movement into what is during the rainier season, freshwater dominant. So you've got this shift in the dominant, salinity, whether it's freshwater or saltwater, in that area. So have introduced physical man-made structures that are affecting that water flow.
Maybe this is a little bit off the subject, but for once and for all, could you clear up for me the difference between a clam, a mussel, and an oyster?
That's a great question.
Well, okay, let's see. There was an oyster being passed around.
It's right over
They're
there.
all bivalves. One of the easy to tell differences between clams and oysters is that clams have a regular growing pattern. It's symmetrical, while oysters will grow to fit the space that they're growing in.
Oh, okay.
And they attach to structures. So this one you could tell was attached to, that was its attachment site. So it was attached to something kind of with that shape. And they attach to hard things. So they will attach to other oysters. They seem to have a chemical signal that they can release to attract other oysters when they are settling. They have a larval phase where the babies drift, and then they will get at a certain point in their development, and also they may respond to a chemical signal in the water, and they'll settle and attach and move after that. And they need to be able to filter water for food and oxygen. So they are attracted to physical, hard things attached to. Mussels also attach to structures. They sometimes will attach to the rhizomes of plants, like our marsh grasses out here. And they will release these. They're kind of liquid when they release them. Have you ever eaten mussels? Anybody ever eaten mussels?
Sure.
So if you've prepared them yourselves, you might have de-bearded mussels. So you're pulling away these structures that they actually use to attach themselves to things. They actually will attach them. Some of them will attach to oysters. So it's called byssus or byssal threads, and so they'll secrete that, and then it will attach to something like oysters or plants, and it's actually kind of elasticy. So if you ever pull on those beards of a mussel, you can see it stretch and then, go back to the pre-stretched state. They're kind of elasticy. Clams there are a lot of different kinds of clams, and some of them will kind of like that driftwood right there. Those holes were made by clams. And they're called shipworms, but they're clams. Clams have a long muscular, well, it's not always long, a muscular foot. Those clams have the muscular foot is really long compared to the length of the shell, so they have kind of a worm-like appearance. Some of them will use their muscular foot to just kind of like among clams in the forms that they grow in. But
Clams and mussels can survive in salinity as well as oysters can't survive in fresh.
Depends on the species, and it depends on where you are.
Yeah. So there are animals that are adapted for freshwater, animals that are adapted for saltwater, including mussels and clams, different species. Range of salinity. So some of them might tolerate some fluctuations in salinity, and then others might be sensitive to salinity changes. So that's generally true for a lot of animals where you've got groups that live in both freshwater and saltwater. So some fish are strictly freshwater, some fish are strictly saltwater. Some of them have a broader tolerance. Some of them move between freshwater and saltwater. With the oysters, they are saltwater species. They can live in salty water and they can live in water that's lower salinity. Another factor that might control where they thrive, besides just the salinity, would be diseases. So sometimes oysters are subject to diseases. So generally, oysters are saltwater, but they can tolerate low salinity.
They found specific projects on oysters. They found that a sudden influx of fresh water after maybe like a big rain event, we call that a pulse of fresh water because it's brief but big. The oysters can close their shells and kind of maintain their own salinity. They're like, I'm good in here until the fresh water passes, but some of those predators on the oysters or other disease organisms can't tolerate the fresh waters. Sometimes those pulses can kind of wash the diseases and the predators away. And then once it subsides, they return to their normal salinity. And so that's another thing we can relate that back to structure, habitat structure, and human impacts. When we dam rivers, when we change the flow of natural water settings, we can change those pulses. And also when we fish oysters, we can contribute to removing that habitat structure. And that's why we're trying to provide those. So that little ball there, if you walk around the garden here, there's like life-size versions of that little reef ball. So that's why we try to put things out like that to kind of re-encourage the oysters to come back.
On that platform right there, you can see it from here.
Yeah, you
the
can see it
bigger
from here.
versions of that reef ball, and then also bar structure. Those were some different restoration structures for oyster reefs. So there was a project a few years ago where the researchers were looking at the effectiveness of different restoration methods.
And
What they're doing out on the
equipment in, and then that's supposed to be put back in the water, kind of flattened out. So there's some extra structure out there. What's that?
that was an oyster bed.
where they're building it, I don't know.
There were oyster reefs there. In that general area. So there are likely oysters in that sediment that they've piled up in order to create those channels.
Yeah. I think what they're hoping with that project, and this is not my project, but I've heard around the lab from people who do work on restoration. I think the hope there is that they can build that breakwater and then also kind of fill that space in with sediment to extend the marsh. And so anytime you do a restoration project, there's gives and takes. Like there's benefits and there's also, less benefit. But what they're hoping is that marsh will fill in. And we do know from research that marsh edge habitat, specifically where those marsh plants meet the water, is a really important structural habitat for fish, and also provides nutrients and other benefits.
We actually have somebody firm that is consulting on that restoration project who will be coming and giving one of these talks in April. So
Cool.
if you'd like to hear more about it.
Yeah.
So this is an unusual general question, but do you, in your field of study, your very broad field of study, do you always conclude with what I've now researched and maybe come to a very causal conclusion? Do you always relate that to the economics? Study it for...
Do you mean Zoey specifically, or just kind of the researchers here at the Sea Lab?
Because I can,
Well,
yeah.
anybody who does water research.
Yeah.
Mostly ocean research, but maybe
Yeah.
water research. I understand.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
I can answer this.
Okay.
Yeah, I got it. I personally, what I study, I like to relate back to what we call management. So any conclusions that I to relate to an issue going on, and it helps then the people who are making rules and are making policy to consider your research in that context. And so it really depends on the researcher, and it depends on what you're studying. So if you're studying like oyster reef restoration, you breakwater or just ecosystem health. Yeah, it depends, but in general, like especially in ecology, where it's kind of a, it's not a hard and fast field a lot of the time. There's a lot of different things going on, a lot of different critters. It helps to tie it back to those economic and those social interests. It helps people understand why it's important as well. So I tried to,
yeah. Generally, we kind of will characterize research as either basic or applied. So you may have research questions or research projects that they don't necessarily have a target application. But these basic research questions kind of contribute to a big picture understanding. And so they're not always tied to economics in that way. But as Zoe said, it helps people kind of understand and contextualize, and it is a motivator, clearly. And of course, there are funding issues. So, if we've got interest in red snapper research because it's an economic engine, then there are research questions that can be addressed, with funding that is specifically there's a motivation to answer some questions specifically about economically valuable species.
And I can give a specific example with the plants and the structural complexity for the plant stuff. So I did my master's on a project funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So they had specific interest in how, and this was all sorts of different aquatic invasive species, what was coming in through like the plant, through the like aquarium trade. So like different things you find at like Petco, how they're coming into the U.S. and how their current regulations related to that. So that project was very management focused. But for this, I personally was like, I've had enough of policy. I kind of want to look into some ecological questions for my own. But the structural complexity questions that we have about these plants directly relate to another project we have going on, which is when you import an aquarium plant from overseas, pretty much everything in this box is almost non-native, but the reason we have plastic models of this is because people buy them for their aquariums. They will buy live probably not milfoil anymore, that's kind of got a bad name to it, but there's other ones that they'll buy. And but when you import something like that, it might have tiny little creatures with it that you didn't intend to import. And so the broader ecological question is, well, how does structural complexity of the plant relate to how organisms use it? But the application would be, okay, well, what are we bringing in through trade? How does what we know about the ecology of the plant play into the economics and rules we can set for trade to prevent impacts? And so it's kind of niche, but so our research has pretty clear management applications, and we usually try to operate that way. But as Mendel said, it's helpful to tie your research questions to broader applications, because as scientists, it's our job to kind of, move forward.
To revert to, this is how bad this is. Do you ever go, well, what can we make out of it now that we don't have a choice?
Yeah, there's certain situations like I think dam infrastructure is a really good one for that. Like back in the, I think like 60s and 70s, we put in all of this different infrastructure, and then down the road we realized, oh my gosh, we've completely altered the hydrology of like most of our river systems, and that has impacts, like I said, on freshwater delivery to the Gulf of Mexico. The Mississippi River is a really good example that's near here, how they've diverted about a third of the flow.
Were you asking about like
might have
finding
gone
a
off
silver
on a
lining?
Yeah.
Well, like milfoil. I mean, you say, oh God, this is terrible. How are we going to mitigate the damage it's doing? Or do you say, I don't know, maybe we can eat it later, or maybe whatever, I don't know.
Yes,
That's my
that does
specific
get done.
question,
I mean,
actually.
so
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of another kind of invasive. It's a terrestrial grass, not a aquatic grass, but Kogan grass is an invasive down here, and it has, covered open sunny areas like the sides of highways and interstates. And so, somebody had the idea, well, it's a grass, it grows well, maybe we can have cows graze it. But they found that the cows wouldn't graze it. It's it's like sharp and unpalatable and right.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I mean, yes, that is done. Like kudzu, one of the ideas was to use it for
Like basket
stabilization.
Those ecosystems are what we call disturbed. So anytime there's a disturbance to the natural state of things, we call that a disturbed ecosystem. So in those cases, a lot of the time our native plants will no longer be happy. They'll no longer grow there. And so sometimes an invasive plant comes in. And so then the question is, well, this is invasive and it's often associated with negative impacts. But if nothing else grows there, is it providing a service at that point? So it's a very case by case thing. And
Philosophy question
that I'm trying to answer through my PhD. It'll be a fun for you. But yeah, so it's very case by case though, because something like with kudzu and things like that, sometimes the solution is we just need to eradicate it as much as we can. And that's,
and it's a perspective. So if our perspective is, well, we want this to go back to an ideal state, some sort of, closer to what has naturally involved. It's a perception, yeah. And so if we can't return this to an ideal state, is this better than
nothing.
the realistic alternative?
And that also relates back to the man-made reefs. If we can't bring back the natural reef, is putting out a reef ball or another type of structure the next best thing that we can do for the ecosystem? So
Can you not alter the DNA?
I don't
Can you
know.
not
Well,
sterilize a milfoil? Can you not?
People are still attempting. I mean,
they're trying to with
that's a good
mosquitoes and
question. They're
things.
still working to come up with solutions like that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll give you another example of one that I think my personal opinion is that this is a little short-sighted, but sometimes there will be a species that goes into an area and it becomes invasive. One of the other characteristics of invasives is that they become invasive because they don't have grazers or predators that can keep their population in check. So then there have been, some attempts to control them have brought their native predators and introduced them.
Oh yeah.
So yes,
Well, like the
we're
big head carpets,
we're still trying,
well,
but
so I was laughing when you mentioned sterilizing, because it's something that they've tried and it's just so hard. It's not that's a completely valid idea that people have thought of. So with the carp, what they try to do, at least with grass carp, because they'll bring in grass carp because they eat plants, and so in some places in Florida, they've put grass carp on purpose so that it'll eat hydrilla and things like that. But the problem is then you have the grass carp proliferating, so they've tried to make those genetically sterile, but it's not always cut and dry. Sometimes you might get one in there or two in there that didn't quite. And then with plants, oh my gosh, they hybridize so easily that it would be almost impossible, I think.
Well, maybe one day, long into
Maybe long
the
in the
future,
future,
somebody is going to be using this foundational research, and we'll just be bioengineering all of the ecosystems out there.
One can hope.
I had a question for you guys. It was a term that Zoey mentioned, but have you heard of ecosystem services? Is that a term that you're familiar with?
Ecosystem services?
Yeah, ecosystem services. So this goes back to your question about tying things to economics. So that is kind of it is a newer
Yeah.
kind of approach or philosophy in the scientific community.
We're still deciding what exactly it means.
And right, and so there is a lot of interest from people who, they want some justification. I mean, that's natural and expected for funding different projects, whether that's research or restoration projects. And so scientists, ecologists particularly, have been attempting to assign economic value to what has come to be called ecosystem services. So as an example, there are countless examples, but Zoe mentioned the grass out there, the marsh grass. It's right at the, if you walked along the boardwalk, you would see it. It serves as nursery ground for a lot of our fisheries species. So you might assign an economic value to the service that ecosystem provides.
I know where you're going. Okay.
Providing viable living space for shrimp, crabs, fish, the things that will grow up to be our harvested seafood. So instead of just assigning a monetary value to them at their point of harvest, you go back and you try to say, well, this ecosystem is valuable, and you could explain why it's valuable, but to put a number on that helps people contextualize its value. So that's certainly not easy work, but it is something that is ongoing.
Can't you just ask ChatGPT?
I mean, you could try. It would probably synthesize a bunch of...
You're asking the big philosophical questions.
Well, like functionally, it probably would synthesize a bunch of research that people have done on ecosystem services, but whether or not it would state it correctly, it probably wouldn't. There's people trying to actually write stuff like scientifically with ChatGPT, and you can't do it because it doesn't quite understand.
So, correct,
Oh, you're fine. Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, but so somebody probably has done either a very direct PhD thesis that you're doing, or there's been a nexus to it. So
And try to backtrack. Thank you guys for coming. You can kind of try and backtrack ecosystem services. I think a good example that I thought of when Mendel was talking about them is oyster reefs. So oyster reefs, there's a difference between ecosystem function and ecosystem service. So the function of the oyster reef is it filters water, provides it slows wave energy to the coast. So the more reef that you have, the slower the waves are during storm events and things like that. And the ecosystem service then to us is cleaner water, more clear water, and then also protecting our properties. So you can assign kind of a property value protection to that. And what they've done in the past with the marsh restoration actually is they'll go back on Google Earth and look at aerial photos from like the 1960s, and they'll say, okay, there was this much marsh in the 1960s, and then they'll fast forward to today on Google Earth and look at how much they've lost, and they can kind of say, okay, this is how much protection we would have had back then potentially. It's very model based. It's very like you're calculating these economic numbers. It's kind of subjective, I think, but
summarily, there are pluses and minuses, but the pluses of the evolution of that.
That's why it's very difficult.
It's subjective,
but but there's some motivation to assign numerical value, to these services to help people, because if we're comparing it to something, that number comparison
Yeah.
helps people think about the
Yeah.
value in a
Have you
more
asked,
tangible way.
Elon Musk about it, or?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Well, they
I don't
have
know if he's motivated to do that kind of work, but
They do require environmental impact assessments, though, when you're trying to build things. So it's incorporated in certain laws and certain management that you do have to, like wetlands, you do have to evaluate your wetlands to the, like you can have a 90% awesome wetlands. And if you take out that wetland, then you have to mitigate somewhere else. It gets really complicated. Evaluating like monetarily ecosystems gets really hard. But,
you gotta have the biologists and ecologists and economists working and model, computer
Yeah.
folks working together to
yeah, things are
create
getting
these models.
increasingly more interdisciplinary.
We went through that
Yeah.
building a house because we have a, where the confluence, actually the confluence of two rivers would be very interesting to study. Because the one river is called the Boardwalk River. We went to an update on that river. It's only 13 miles long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But unlike every other river in Wisconsin, has double the number of fish, even though
Oh, wow.
even though it's a tiny river. Clams and mussels. Being a species or two of fish and a species or two of clams and mussels are only found there.
Right.
And what's amazing is when you see the confluence, the T, you can look at one side of a kayak and you can't see down an inch.
Yeah.
And you can look down here and you can
Yeah.
see down 15 feet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
But we built our house, so we're part of that basic area, and a lot of that land was considered to be wetlands, not because it was wet,
Stop the recording.
not because it was wet, but
Thanks for
because
joining us.
the soil indicated